ég, forstjóri Samkeppniseftirlitið, svo velkomin, bæði hér á Grand Hotel og heima í stofu eða hvar sem þið eruð á netinu. Samkeppniseftirlitið stendur hérna fyrir morgunfundi áhrif samkeppni, hagvöxt og launakjör og okkur þótti það við hæfi vegna þess að núna höfum við verið að kynnast verðhækkunum, verðbólgu að nýju og kjarasamningar eru framundan, mikil ólga að því leitinu og ástæða til þess að huga því hvort að það sé ekki skynsamlegt að styrkja samkeppni til þess að bæta launakjör og ég tók eftir því í gær í nýjustu útgáfu vísbendingar, þá Katrín Ólafsdóttir, dósent við HR, einmitt að velta því upp. En það eru hér erlendi gestir og líka á netinu, þannig að við snúum okkur núna yfir á enska tungu. Good morning, dear guests, both here at Grand Hotel and on the internet. My name is Gunnar Pálsson. I'm the Director General of the Icelandic Competition Authority. And I have the honor to welcome you to this hybrid morning conference where we will discuss how competition affects economic growth and labor markets. And this is a highly relevant topic in an economic environment where increasing inflation and rising cost of living threatens the well-being of employees and consumers alike. And it's also a timely discussion taking into account the upcoming wage negotiations between trade unions and employers in Iceland. And with these huge challenges before us, it's important to identify the benefits of competition for both employees and employers. It is indeed widely recognized that competition can benefit employees, as national competition authorities in many jurisdictions have in the past intervened in markets where anti-competitive mergers or agreements would have harmed workers. Last June, we organized a similar event where we discussed how competition can curb soaring inflation, how lack of competition can set the scene for business charging more than necessary to cover rising costs, and by that accelerating inflation, and likewise how inflation can reduce the awareness of consumers and set the scene for anti-competitive behavior. And it's in this context that we have invited Fiona Scott Morton to address how competition can boost economic growth and positively affect labor markets. Fiona is the Theodore Nierenberg Professor of Economics at the Yale School of Management. She has a BA from Yale and PhD from the MIT, both in economics, and her area of academic research is industrial organization with a focus on empirical studies of competition. And from 2011 to 2012, she served as Deputy Assistant Attorney General, Chief Economist for Economics at the Antitrust Division of the U.S. Department of Justice, where she helped enforce the nation's antitrust laws. And she's a frequent and popular speaker at conferences around the world. And this is actually the second time you have helped us, Fiona, in this way, as you took part in a conference we held in the middle of COVID-19 on the internet, online conference, where we discussed competition policy in times of crisis, more specifically COVID-19. But now you are finally here in person, and we are really grateful for that. And we want to make the most of your visit. This is the first of 3 events that you will attend for us in a matter of 1.5 days. And And the second contribution will be later today, where you will discuss management and ownership ties, common ownership, with several government and bodies with responsibilities in that area. And tomorrow morning you will address the annual autumn meeting of the Nordic Competition Authorities, which is hosted this year in Iceland. So we are indeed happy to have you here, Fiona. We have organized this event in such a way that after your presentation, Gylfi Magnússon, professor of economics at the University of Iceland, will reflect on your presentation in the Icelandic context. And following a Q&A led by Valur Þráinsson, the chief economist of the Icelandic Authority, Lilja Dögg Alfreðsdóttir, the Minister of Culture and Business Affairs, responsible for competition, will close the meeting. So, Fiona, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Gunnar, for that very lovely introduction, and thanks to Valur for inviting me and repeatedly inviting me, which I am just delighted to be here. I think Iceland is beautiful, so it's a great pleasure. Okay, so I do use this. Okay, great. I thought I would go back to basics on labor markets for just a minute before we get into policy, and remind you all what we are talking about. So here the key word is monopsony, and monopsony, of course, is symmetric to monopoly. Monopoly is one seller of a good. Monopsony is one buyer of a good. And when there's one buyer of the good, the seller does not have a choice about who to sell to, and may have to accept a price for their good or service that is below the competitive price. And you might think in the United States context, we have a lot of problems with farmers in this regard. Farmers, if you grow pigs, which are called hogs in the United States, they're the size of a small car, and transporting them is very costly, and so you can go only to slaughterhouses that are within some distance from the farm. And often this gives the farmers not too much choice. Same with chickens, and same with any kind of specialized labor. Nurses is a category I'll come back to. But workers in general face monopsony power on the part of their employers. Okay, what does that look like? Sorry, I'm going to take you back to school just for a minute. Okay, this is the graph. We have essentially a demand curve sloping down and the supply curve sloping up. And what you see here is the firm, instead of being here, is going to walk its way down the supply curve, and instead of paying this W prime, which is what they're supposed to pay, the competitive wage, they will pay a lower wage. And that means that these nurses will be unemployed, not working as a nurse, but by restricting output, the firm can lower its cost. Okay, so this is the canonical model developed by Joan Robinson in the 1930s. So when the firm walks down the supply curve, it lowers its input price, the wage. It creates more profit, because that gray rectangle is now profit that it was formerly going to the workers and now goes to the firm. And it also creates deadweight loss because there is less output. So that orange, the yellow triangle is surplus from those workers that's not being realized. Okay. Monopsony is very trendy today in the United States. It's funny, I don't quite know why. I mean, for the last, I think we can blame the labor economists, but I know that that's a little edgy. But the labor economists have for the last 30 years really been relying on the neoclassical model and assuming a flat labor supply curve, which by introspection, yourself, if your employer paid you 5% less, would you immediately leave for a different employer? I think many of us would answer no. So it's not a good assumption. For those of you with spare time, David Card is the current president of the American Economics Association, and he gave an annual address where he talked about exactly this issue. Why have labor economists not focused on monopsony? And it's a very good talk. Anyway, the evidence finally caught up with this assumption. In the United States, we have declining power of unions, and unionization as a share of workers has been falling. We have a lot of reduction in the bargaining power of workers that has come through changes in our laws, driven by both Congress and the Supreme Court. Mandatory arbitration rather than being able to go to court, non-compete clauses, and other tactics. And labor has declined as a share of national income in the United States. So one response to that is to start thinking about enforcement in labor markets and using enforcement as a direct use of competition policy to help workers rather than indirect. Normally we help workers by saying, let's make sure the price of automobiles and mobile phones and furniture is competitive, and that will make their wages go farther. But of course, if their wages are 10% too low, then enforcing in labor markets makes wages go up, and that's a really significant impact. So another reason why this is very trendy among enforcement today is because you don't need anything new. You don't need new economics, you don't need new law, you don't need new policy tools. It's all right there sitting in front of you. It's an input market. We always enforce in input markets. It's anti-competitive conduct. That's what we do anyway. So it's just very straightforward to say, here will be an enforcement priority. Let's take the tools we already have and go forward. And at least in the United States, it's a lot easier to get anything done if you can claim that it is old, right? This is old, it's known, it's established, I'm not doing anything radical or new, and this is theory from the 1930s. I want to tell you about a leading paper in this area because this has really focused people's attention greatly on monopsony in two kinds of settings, mergers and then just more general labor markets. So there's a really great paper by Ellie Prager and Matt Schmidt from last year, or I guess it's published this year, about hospital mergers. And what they do is they look at hospital mergers and the impact on nursing wages. So we have always looked at hospital mergers anyway, because hospital mergers affect how much people pay for hospital care, because our hospitals in the United States are private. So if two of them were to merge and become a monopoly, then purchasing hospital care gets more expensive. But we can also ask, is that transaction lowering wages in that geographic labor market for the specialized kinds of workers, not the janitors, but the nurses and the physicians? So it's a very good setting to study monopsony because we have this specific human capital, the nurses, and there's probably only a small set of employers in a geography demanding that labor. There will be some homes for old people and some clinics and so on, but if you are an oncology nurse, you're pretty much working at the hospital. And we can easily measure hospital mergers, and we have pretty good data on wages for groups like nurses. So what they do is they they take a set of, they take all hospital mergers in the United States for a decade or so, and they look at the impact of the merger on wages. Now, what do they not do? They don't measure a correlation between wages and a measure of concentration in the marketplace, HHI. The reason you don't correlate wage and HHI, just go across all cities and say, how many hospitals are there? Let's look and see how that relates to nursing wages. Because in the United States, we have rural areas where there are fewer employers, and so the concentration of employers is higher. There's only 3 instead of 30, so your HHI is very high. And they are also low productivity areas, and so wages are lower. So what you see is high HHI and low wages, and this is just an artifact of rural versus urban. So this is not a good research design. There are a lot of papers like that out there, but I would urge you not to read those. What you need is an experiment, an exogenous change in HHI that's driven by something like a merger. And you can look before and after and measure the impact on wages. And this is what these authors do. And they take, as I said, all hospital mergers in the US during a time period, and they look at the impact on wages, and they discover, well, nothing is happening. And then they isolate out the mergers where there's actually a substantial increase in market power. So instead of 7 hospitals to 6, it's 2 hospitals to 1 or 3 hospitals to 2. They find these mergers, and then they look at the wages of nurses compared to administrators, like the accountants for the hospitals, compared to the cleaning staff at the hospital. And they discover that there is no impact on the wages of the cleaning staff, and that is because you can clean at lots of different employers. There isn't much market power change for those workers. The administrators, they find a small change because it turns out hospitals are a highly regulated sector, and the specifics of how you do accounting and billing and so on are quite specific to that sector. So they have a small wage decline, and nurses have a really substantial wage decline. So I shouldn't have said change, I should have said fall in both of those cases. So what this paper does is really hammered home the point that when you have a change in the employment options for a specialized sort of labor, you get this monopsony power effect and wages fall. Okay, and this is another way to look at mergers, not just on the product market, but on the input market side. So it's very interesting. Okay, and then there's another kind of monopsony, which I want to highlight because in the United States, there will be people who will say you shouldn't enforce this kind. And that's because if the monopsony is arrived at through bargaining power, rather than through walking down the supply curve and restricting output, if instead it's just a bargaining game, we're going to definitely have Q. We're going to keep Q the same, but I'm just going to pay you less for your video content. I'm Comcast, and I'm going to pay less to Disney for video content. Then there's no change in quantity, there's no deadweight loss, but the input supplier gets paid less. Okay, now, there are people who say, well, if this happens, the input is that the firm has lower costs. And if the firm has lower costs, then the price of the product will fall and we will all be better off. Isn't that good? Okay? And the answer is I don't actually think that that's good. And there's a couple of reasons why it's not good. So first, you would have to assume that the lower costs are passed through to consumers. And if the company in question has market power on the product market, it's not clear that that's going to happen. So it might be they pay less to Disney for the content and then nothing happens to the subscription price. So that's one empirical issue. But the more important issue is that you want inputs in the economy to be priced at their competitive level so everyone has the right incentive to invest and to innovate and to provide the kind of input that people want. So if you don't pay nurses enough, you just pay them less than their competitive price, not as many people will train to be a nurse, or they will move to a different city. I mean, eventually you're going to have an impact on nurses because you are not paying them properly, and they are smart people. They will find some other job that pays them a competitive wage. So it's not good in the long run for consumers to be having goods and services supplied at something other than the competitive price. The competitive price gets us allocative efficiency, high productivity, everybody going to the right job, resources in the right place. Okay, so the long run effect when you have this decline in the input price is an effect on Q, whether it's output or whether it's the quality of the product. So you can imagine in the case of Disney, you don't get paid for your content, you just invest less. You don't hire quite so many fancy people and fancy machines to make your cartoons. Okay, so a note on unions. As I started this talk, I observed that in the United States we do not have the unionized environment that you have here and that is present in much of Europe. In Prager and Schmidt, what is really interesting is that they have a lot of different cities in their analysis, and some of those cities have much stronger union presence than others. And what they find is that the impact on wages, the decline in wages, is lessened in places where the union is stronger. So this is evidence that the union is able to bargain and protect the nurses from this exercise of market power of walking down the supply curve. It could, and it's consistent with either type of monopsony power, either walking down the supply curve and reducing quantity, or this just straight up bargaining model where quantity isn't an issue. Another way that unions protect workers is by protecting them from something called fishering, which is a very interesting way to exercise monopsony power. So remember I told you the classic model of monopsony is the firm hires fewer nurses and in that way walks down the supply curve and pays them less. Well, if the firm does that, it then doesn't have enough nurses. Okay, so one option is just to restrict the amount of medical care, but of course the hospital doesn't really want to do that. So, because people will be upset and it's a lost opportunity. So what they do in the United States is they go to what we call a temporary hiring firm or like a travel nurse supplier, and they hire just a few nurses on the edge who are coming in temporarily to fill in that gap between the competitive quantity and the monopsony quantity. And this might be fairly expensive to do, but if you're paying everybody else less than the normal wage, then you can still come out ahead. So the firm hires temporary workers who are not temporary, or they are just always rotating, to fill in this little gap. And then the inframarginal workers get below their competitive wage, and the workers are worse off. So a union can prevent this kind of thing by saying, no, you can't have perpetual temporary workers. If you need those workers, then we are supplying that labor, and we are all, by the way, getting paid the same wage, not the temporary workers getting a high wage and everyone else getting a low wage. Okay, another tactic for exercising monopsony power is called we call it no poach. When I was at the Department of Justice, we found out that the technology firms in Silicon Valley were actually colluding. They had explicit agreements between the CEOs, Steve Jobs was particularly terrible, agreeing not to make offers, not to cold call workers at other firms. If the worker reached out and said, I want to work at the firm, then that was a different category. But everybody was in on this agreement. Apple, Google, Intuit, Pixar, Lucasfilm, Intel, Adobe, it was terrible. Okay, they were all there. So the Department of Justice prosecuted this no poach civilly. So for us, we have criminal enforcement of the antitrust laws, and normally if you're in a cartel, this is a criminal violation. But I think because it was Steve Jobs and Silicon Valley, there was some political hesitancy to do that, and also this was the first one of these uncovered in the modern era. So it was prosecuted civilly and settled, but then DOJ announced, look, if we find any more of these, it's a criminal violation, you are going to jail. And there have been more. Railroads, more in technology, some healthcare, like nursing home cases. So I don't quite understand what managers in the United States are thinking, because this is obviously illegal and it's been announced to be illegal, and we continue to prosecute. So that's something that might be, I don't know if that might be happening in Iceland, but I just caution you, it seems more prevalent than I would have expected. Another way to exercise monopsony power is something we call a non-compete clause. Now, this is a condition that is frequently required for highly paid key employees. So let's imagine that I'm a physician and I invent a new way to fix your hand, and it's really very good, but I can only do 2 operations per day. So I'm going to teach Valur how to fix a hand, and I say to him, okay, if I teach you, you have to set up your practice in a different city from me, because I am here and I'm in Atlanta and I want you to be somewhere else. So this is completely fine and normal and not a competition problem. But we have many of these non-compete clauses in the United States for fast food workers, for very low paid, low skill, ordinary workers. Many of them have this clause in their employment contract. And there just really is no theoretical reason for that, because if you are flipping a hamburger, this is not a firm-specific skill that we are worried about investment in. So what is the argument here? Well, the franchise agreement, let's think about McDonald's. So McDonald's and franchisee A promises in their agreement with McDonald's not to hire a worker who's currently at franchisee B, or has been in the last 6 months. And in fact, if you apply for a job at B and you work at A, there's a question. Do you work at McDonald's, or have you worked in the last 6 months? And if you answer yes to that question, they throw away your application. And they do not even tell you that they're throwing it away. You're just not considered. This, of course, has stopped since these cases began. But this was uncovered by the Washington State Attorney General. We have an interesting system in the United States where each of the 50 states has an Attorney General who can enforce the antitrust laws. And he discovered these and launched dozens of cases against all of these fast food franchises, and they have all been settling. So these clauses are no longer present for those companies. But the question for this group would be, in a franchise situation, are franchisees A and B different companies or the same company? They're both part of McDonald's. They have a franchise agreement with McDonald's. But of course, they are actually separate businesses owned by different people who are competing for workers in the labor market of that town. So I think it's pretty clear in a labor market context, they are competitors. Oops, I don't know why I have this. Oh, this is left over from my class. I'm sorry. Okay. Do franchise A and B compete? Yes, they do. If I am thinking about which McDonald's will I go to that's more conveniently located or has a shorter line or a nicer bathroom, and it's going to be also true in the labor market. So A and B should not be competing for workers if they're truly one firm. So what is the what's the harm? Well, so what A will say is, look, I trained this worker, and now B is taking them away, and that hurts me because I invested in teaching them how to flip this hamburger. Okay, I think that's a not very plausible argument, but if it were, and why, so stopping the worker from going to B is, of course, a harm to the worker because if you are good at flipping burgers at McDonald's A, you might be qualified to be an assistant manager at B. And there might not be an opening for an assistant manager at A, and so you would prefer to be able to change franchisees in order to move up. And so the franchisees object to enforcement of the competition laws and that says you may not do this. But I think it's pretty easy to explain why this is not a problem. If really McDonald's thought that this was a problem, McDonald's could require in the contract that B compensates A for the training costs if they hire the worker. Or McDonald's could pay for training workers and include that in the franchise agreement. So there's a lot of ways, I think, to solve this problem if it were to exist. I don't think it exists, but if it's helpful to have an answer when people say it exists. So restricting employee mobility is a much more harmful tactic than is needed to solve this problem. Okay, there's another great paper that I urge you to look at, Lipsitz and Starr. They look at Oregon, and in Oregon, the state made non-competes unenforceable and also expensive for companies in 2008. And they look at wage data before and after, and what they show is that low-wage workers are affected, their wages rise after this non-compete is taken away, and their mobility goes up. They change jobs a lot more. And in particular, the old people's wages rise more than young. Now, why is this? Because if you are going to be trapped into your job forever, in a perfectly competitive world, the employer needs to pay the young workers more because you have to compensate them for entering that restrictive contract. Otherwise, they can't move, so you got to pay them more, and you pay the old workers less. In a world where they can move, if I'm being trained, I accept a low wage because I understand it's part of I'm getting training plus a wage, and my wages will rise tomorrow because I will be more productive tomorrow. So you have this slope. And what you see in the data is not that went from flat to a slope, like the young people's wages went down. Everybody's wages go up. It's just that the old people's wages go up more. So this is really good evidence that these non-compete clauses were holding back workers and causing wages to be lower than they otherwise would have been. There were no changes in hours worked, and more people moved from an hourly wage to a salary, which was the salaried workers were not affected by the regulation change. Okay, so all of the evidence from Oregon is completely consistent with exercise of monopsony power in a way that's bad for workers. So to wrap up, there's a lot of new economic work on imperfections in labor markets, and we are finding a great deal of these. We just do not have perfectly competitive labor markets at all. And also lots of evidence of exercise of monopsony power by firms, that if there's a way to squeeze it out, the firm is going to do that through these kinds of either agreements between firms or contract clauses or ways of fissuring the labor force or merging, all of these different techniques. We have seen exercise of monopsony power. So there are a lot of choices that governments can make regarding the laws and the rules around non-competes, around unionization, around other contractual laws and just rules. And then there's plenty to do, I think, for a competition authority in terms of enforcing competition in labor markets in a way that helps workers. So there was a quick part of my introduction was GDP and the impact on economic growth. And I didn't say much about that because that's a little bit straying into macro, which is not a thing I do very often. But I'll just repeat I think something very important, which is if all your factors of production are being paid a competitive price, okay, then you have high productivity. Then everybody's getting what they're supposed to be getting. You invest in the right place, you allocate resources correctly, and you have more chance for good growth and all the things that we want in an economy. So I think that's I think the fundamental reason why it's good for economic growth to have markets working properly. So I will stop there, and thank you very much.
Good morning. Thank you, Fiona, for your interesting speech. I do hope that it will serve as a foundation for further discussion here at this meeting. I'll be moderating the rest of the meeting. It's probably the easiest task of those that stand here, but still an important one, so we'll all get back to work on time. Before I go on, there's just one housekeeping rule that I would like to emphasize, which is the following. After Gylfi's talk, I encourage you all to raise your hands if you have questions. Don't wait till the end. The time will be running out. So if you're going to have some time for Q&A, I think that we have to be quite efficient in our approach. So next on stage is Gylfi Magnússon. He is a university professor at the School of Business at the University of Iceland, former chair of the board of the Icelandic Competition Authority. He's as well served in the Icelandic Cabinet in 2009 and 2010. And if you look at his beautiful homepage, then his research is very diverse. So he has done research on micro and macro and economics, and I could go on the whole day, or even on common ownership as well. But I'm not going to delay this meeting any further, so welcome, Gylfi.
Okay, thank you, Valur. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to start by thanking Professor Fiona Scott Morton for her insightful and thought-provoking lecture. The issue of how competition affects the standard of living is certainly of global importance. But for us here in Iceland, one of the world's smallest national economies, it is a burning issue. With a local economy that's approximately 1,000th of the size of the US economy, and an order of magnitude at least smaller than those of mid-sized European countries, the problems of small scale and limited competition are endemic on the island. I will not discuss in detail or address the link to labor markets that Fiona described very well, but instead discuss the broader picture. It should, though, be noted that although the Icelandic labor market certainly has strong elements of monopsony, even one-company towns in rural areas in many cases, the market is also characterized by a very high level of unionization so that wage negotiations could be described as a game between a monopsonist and a monopoly, which is significantly different than what you would see in most cases in the US, where unionization is far less widespread. But be that as it may, in the non-traded sector of the Icelandic economy, the part that serves local with little or no foreign competition, it is quite common to have between 2 and 4 companies splitting the market between them, the sales volume for each of them being much smaller than is the norm in the same industry in neighboring countries. And those 2 to 4 companies are in many industries under common ownership through Iceland's pension system, which is by far the largest investor in local markets, with assets, both local and overseas, close to 2 times GDP. In almost all Icelandic markets, there are low or no significant regulatory barriers to entry. Indeed, they are generally wide open to competitors from the whole European economic area. The markets are just too small to attract new competitors, local or foreign. The incumbents will, in some cases, be making substantial profits for such small-scale operations, but that is still not enough to attract new competitors, and those that do enter sometimes give up. I note that even McDonald's, they can do business just about everywhere, and Fiona discussed extensively, came to Iceland but gave up and exited more than a decade ago. On average, the companies in Iceland are though not necessarily unusually profitable. Retail prices may be extremely high, but measures such as value added per worker or return on capital employed do not show a great difference between Iceland and the neighboring countries. Being in, for example, the retail business in Iceland does not seem exceptionally profitable. The business model seems to be considerably lower volume per outlet and per worker, with a significantly higher markup, but resulting in mediocre profit. So this sounds disastrous, does it not? Well, fortunately, this is not the whole story. Iceland also has a traded sector, competing in world markets. Although the traded sector in Iceland has fewer pillars than you would expect in a larger economy, the companies tend to be reasonably sized for their respective industries, and they pretty much all face fierce and global competition. Iceland, of course, has no market share in a lot of markets, but in the global markets for both seafood, excluding aquaculture, and aluminum, the world market share is well over 1%, which is impressive for such a tiny country. And note that these are not even Iceland's largest export sectors. That title belongs to tourism, or at least belonged to tourism pre-pandemic, and presumably will also post-pandemic. The traded sector, which also includes various other smaller segments, is generally highly productive, innovative, and the main engine for economic growth in Iceland. Exports, measured in euros, grew by an astonishing 250% between 1999 and 2019, before contracting temporarily during the pandemic. The success of the traded sector and the relatively dismal performance of the non-traded sector is, of course, a good example of the economic benefits of vibrant competition. This finding is not unique to Iceland. One can see a somewhat similar pattern in many other countries, some even much larger than Iceland, notably Japan. There are a few shining stars in the non-traded sector in Iceland, but they tend to be local monopolies. A somewhat embarrassing finding for the Competition Authority, perhaps. But these are special cases, namely utilities run by local governments. They are highly efficient, benefit from natural resources, and provide energy, water, etc., at a fairly low cost, or even a very low cost, compared to the neighboring countries. And that's, of course, a true blessing under current circumstances, with gas, electricity, etc., getting in price in the rest of Europe, although that may not be due to inefficiencies of the operations of the companies. So this helps, but it is mainly a consequence of having a highly efficient traded sector that Icelanders are generally quite well off, with a high standard of living and a GDP per capita that is well above the EU average. Income and GDP per capita are even high and well above the EU average when adjusted for the very high cost of living, which is on average about 50% higher than in the EU, and usually the highest or second or third highest in all of Europe. So Icelanders are rich when traveling abroad, but merely affluent when buying goods and services from each other. Historically, or at least since the advent of the jet age, this has meant that when Icelanders travel abroad, they bring a large suitcase. It is half empty when you take off, but bursting at the seams with stuff when you get back. Clothes and electronics, mobile phones, cameras, etc. Are good examples of the stuff that Icelanders tend to buy abroad. And Icelanders have also taken to online shopping from foreign retailers with a vengeance. Again, this is a clear example of the benefit to consumers from competitive markets. When Icelanders get the chance to trade in larger and more vibrant markets, they get much better deals than at home. There is, of course, no easy solution for this challenge for the Icelandic economy. We certainly need robust work by the Competition Authority based on state-of-the-art legislation, most of it imported from the EU and usually originating in the US at some point. That can accomplish a lot, but does not change the fundamental challenge of most industries having few competitors operating at small scale. Further integration with larger markets would of course help, but this is not easy to accomplish. Joining the European Economic Area was a giant step taken in the early 90s, opening up markets and harmonizing regulation. The economic benefits have been substantial, even if Icelanders did not put all the freedom that followed to good use, in particular not the freedom to expand the financial sector across borders at a breakneck pace. That ended disastrously, but that's another story. As previously noted, due to the EEA agreement, most markets are open to foreign competition, so legislative barriers to such entry are not a major issue. The main exception is agriculture, which is fiercely protected with tariff and non-tariff barriers and subsidies. Getting rid of all that would take a political miracle. Other markets, however, could be integrated with larger international markets, but that calls for solutions from the private sector on market terms. That may happen eventually with some segments of the Icelandic economy moving from the non-traded to the traded sector. Usually this simply means that imports replace local production. Although not a painless process, it can be highly beneficial in the long run. One related development is direct trade with Icelandic consumers bypassing local middlemen. Nothing wrong with that either. So up to a degree, we can solve local problems and lack of competition by trading in highly competitive markets. Fighting global titans with uncompetitive tendencies, and Fiona had a long list of them at the end of her talk. That's another issue that I don't really have time to go into today. But let it suffice to say that in that field, Iceland will have to rely on initiative and actions by larger political entities with more clout, mainly the European Commission in our case, but also to some extent the US. Thank you.
Thank you, Gylfi. Now we will open the floor for questions, but before we do that, I wanted to mention that this event is as well streamed online, so those that have questions, Haukur will be running around with him with his microphone to the ones that, if there are any. But before we take the first question, I wonder, are there any thoughts that either that Fiona has on Gylfi's talk? I know you're having coffee now, but or tea? I know. You never can get away. Okay.
I do think it is very interesting to think about which kinds of markets you can benefit from the larger economies, either in globally or in the EU, versus what markets are restricted geographically. And labor markets are restricted geographically. So I think this is like a link between the two thoughts here. And a lot of I gave you a long list of things that can go wrong in labor markets. I think unionization is a good place to start for how to combat those things. But again, if you have, as you said, a monopolist and a monopsonist, you probably want some government supervision in there to make sure that, there's no guarantee that comes out well, one monopolist, one monopsonist, so that's quite tricky also.
Thank you. Are there any hands that I see? Or any questions? I'm interested maybe to hear from, I know there's a representative here from one of the unions here in Iceland, and the consumer associations. Fiona's talk on the problems that the US has experienced in labor markets, are these problems that you see here in Iceland?
Yeah, okay. I actually came a bit late, and I was watching it online, but I was watching the wrong broadcast, so I missed a part of Fiona's talk. But sorry, what was your question again?
She mentioned a lot of. She mentioned few topics such as no-poach agreement, where employees have decided that they will not try to hire each other employees or try to cold call them. And she has mentioned that in the US, where you have low-level unionization, the firm has greater market power vis-a-vis their employees than here in Iceland. So I wonder
if I have some thoughts on that.
Yes, I know this is a cold call on you.
A bit, but
as well, we know that you and the unions have been quite critical on Icelandic firms in regard to the inflationary environment that we have now, price hikes that we have, and you have mentioned that could be related to lack of competition.
Yes.
Is that something that you could reflect on?
Yes, exactly. Like Gylfi talked about in his errand, Iceland is a really small market, and we have some special circumstances here, although there are some economies, I guess, that experience something similar. So, of course, the whole inflation is not because of lack of competition, but what I think, and I mean, if you look at circumstances when companies are, having this much, when they're benefiting this much, and price hikes are so high, I mean, it looks like there is something. There is some competition factors playing a part. So I think Iceland would benefit a lot from increased competition. And like Gylfi said, the problem is, of course, the geographical position. But it's interesting to see, if you see price development in Iceland, it's pretty clear, or at least you can see some you can see that in markets that have opened and where competition has increased, like with clothes and shoes and etc., prices have actually increased way less for the past 10 years than in sectors where you don't have this foreign competition, like in the retail sector, or, I mean, in the food sector, the banking sector, and so on. So, but about the labor markets, like Gylfi went through, I mean, we have over 90% of Icelandic labor being a part of unions. So I think that really matters here, and is also, I mean, and which affects competition in whole. So but we definitely have a lot of stuff to work on and increase competition both in the labor market and in the regarding prices is really important.
Thank you. Now we're reaching to the end, but I see that we have the Business Association here and as well the Association for Consumers and one member of the Parliament. So, Breki, you go.
No, I would like to ask the panel about, are there any ways we can increase competition in Iceland, and what should we do to do that?
Fiona.
I think you are the expert.
Gylfi, do you have any thoughts?
No, but I haven't given up.
Okay. Still thinking about it. But I think that's that. You could take it from another angle and ask Fiona, should you discussed labor markets in countries where we have the labor market as unionized as in Iceland, should that be a focus of the Competition Authority here, or should we just leave this to the unions to bargain vis-a-vis?
No, I think you have to supervise, because it's, again, the monopolist problem. I mean, I'm afraid I am not so sure that I trust either side, right? If you put all workers in one pot and then give them market power, they will exercise it. That's what everybody does. If you give employers market power, they will exercise it. So in a world where you can't have competition because the market is too small and you inevitably have a monopolist seller of labor and a monopolist buyer of labor, then really any point in between the two extremes is a possible equilibrium. It depends on bargaining. So I think the Competition Authority definitely has a role there to be thinking about what tactics everybody's using and the outside options, and is there as much competition as you can make happen. I mean, at least get every piece that's possible. Mm-hmm. But I think it's quite difficult. Yeah,
and it probably can be quite unclear when negotiating the unions and the business associations, when the business associations are colluding and when they're just negotiating vis-a-vis the unions. And yeah, I know our minister is here and she is strict on time, but finally I see one member of the parliament here, Helga Vala and Gunnar from Viðskiptaráð. Are there any questions that you would like to raise here in the end and ask Fiona or Gylfi about?
Several, of course. Because we have such a tiny market here. Is there any chance that we can both protect workers that have very special skills in the market and maybe protect the companies that need them? I mean, because they can travel around the world and they can, of course, raise their wages above everything and above the normal market. I mean, this is.
Yeah, I mean.
This is what I'm concerning.
I think you don't have to worry too much about the employees raising wages, because, I mean, let's say they're a digital nomad and they live here because they like walking and going to hot springs, and then they get paid some amount that a digital nomad, whatever their skill set is. Well, then an employee, a company here, this is a normal wage for whatever that digital service is and that is being sold in a global marketplace. So I think it's okay for the company. One thing you can think about is having good laws about all the features of the bargaining around wages, like disclosure. In the United States, we have an issue about whether you must, sometimes employers ask job applicants, what were you paid at your last job? And then they try to pay just a little bit more than that. And perhaps the person's last job was irrelevant or was being a waitress or something. So then there are some laws that say you may not ask this. So those kinds of laws that restrict what each side can ask and timing and information disclosure, I think these might be interesting to look at.
Thank you, Fiona. I think we're coming to an end. Maybe to sum up, maybe the best strategy for Iceland is just to look at the US and see the pitfalls there, and instead of investigating thoroughly what should be your tactic, maybe it should be just don't do what US has been doing in many, at least what concerns the labor market. But before I invite Lilja Alfreðsdóttir, our distinguished Minister of Culture and Business, to give her closing remark, I want to thank Gylfi and Fiona for their participation in this morning, and of course all of you that attended. Lilja has been member of the cabinet since 2016 and the Minister of Culture and Business Affairs since November 21. Prior to her political career, she held various positions at the Central Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Lilja holds a master's degree in economics from Columbia University in Iceland, and I would like to invite her to have the floor now and close the meeting.
So, ladies and gentlemen, first I would like to thank you for this great seminar. I kind of wanted to go back to school in Fiona's presentation, and Gylfi was, of course, very good, giving a very good overview, and I was concerned that he maybe saw me once or twice when I was coming from the US with my bags, and, you know, but he's absolutely right in that Icelanders, they are very much aware of prices. Basically, to wrap this up, I just wanted to say I think having seminars, having presentations like this by the competition authorities are very important, because it raises awareness, and it's always a reminder that, you know, a system is not just a system. You need to, you know, have effective surveillance, and it is the authorities' obligation to make certain that the environment for the competition of the competition and its surveillance is in such an environment that they can act. And we see the economic benefits always in countries, and the history really shows the economic benefits of an active competition authorities. And what I wanted to basically say here is that, you know, we are in this really challenging environment, and if you look at, you know, the key challenges, you know, I look at the central bank right in front of me here, Gunnar and Gylfi. It's of course inflation, and the competition authorities obviously play a major role in that. What do I mean? I thought it was extremely good when they started to supervise key markets on whether some extra price taking was taking place due to this, jitters in the markets and the challenges coming after post-COVID, and then with the war and invasion in Ukraine. But I think the Competition Authority in Iceland, there's a general favor of the public in that regard. What do I mean? Icelanders, if you look at history, are basically the foundation of modern society is based on the notion of free trade. Icelanders had a history of being under, first the Norwegian king and then the Danish authorities, and they acted or they implemented a monopoly trade. And if you just look at, GDP and the way things were going in Iceland under those regimes, I think that that was not the proudest moment in our history. So it is very much embedded into the Icelandic consumer. They are very much aware of prices because we are a very literate and educated nation. So it doesn't need, you don't really have to encourage the Icelanders to be aware of this. So I think to a certain extent we are in a good environment. And another aspect that works in our favor is that we love new technology. And we love comparing prices, since now we can use the technology, shopping even, in our phones, in our bed. I made actually a lot of mistakes like that, especially buying clothing, and I basically stopped doing that. But what I'm trying to say is the environment is very good as regards to public awareness, and we need to utilize that. Especially when we are in this inflation environment, we need to, bring out information on what's happening in key markets, and the Competition Authority is doing that. A second challenge is that because the economy here, and not just here, has been very robust, and we've seen a lot of mergers and acquisitions. And that has, of course, made our Competition Authority very busy. And we as an authority, we need to take that into account when we're thinking about the infrastructure or the surroundings of the competition authorities. So that's something that I am looking into in my ministry. I'm not going to go over the history of competition or anything like that, but just as a final remark, it's very important that we keep on this informative talks on competition and consumer rights. I've told the consumer associations that I want to place a special emphasis on the rights of consumers. That I think that even though Icelanders are very much aware of, competition, sometimes they're not as much aware of their consumer rights. And I want to have a special effort in that because I think it helps competition. So that's one of the things on my agenda. Otherwise, to conclude, I just want to encourage you to continue doing your, good job, and have and hold seminars that are, that gives us encouragement and comes with, research that puts a firm case basically on how important competition is. So thank you very much, and I look very much forward to the cooperation with you. Thank you.